come to understand what we're talking about today, it could change your life. So what I want to talk about this morning is a simple topic, and that topic is joy. Joy is the thing that I want to talk about. So to start, what I want to ask you to do is, in your mind, come up with a mental image of what you think about when you think of joy. Now, I'm going to take a couple of things out of the question to start with. Joy does not mean happiness. Joy also does not just mean general optimism about the world. It's something different. So keep that in mind, this idea of joy, what do you think it is, while we read our main passage for this morning. This comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You may know this as the love chapter, the part where it says love is patient, love is kind, and it explains love. But we're going to read the back half of that chapter. And here we go, starting in verse 8. Love never fails, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. This is the most important verse, verse 12 for today. For now, we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I also have been fully known. But now faith, hope, love, abide these three, but the greatest of these is love. I wonder if any of you here have anything in your life, maybe a hobby or a thing that you're interested in, something that you like that you might feel embarrassed to share with other people at moments. So you like it, but maybe you've been hurt before. You know, there's not many things more painful than you talk about something that you like and then everyone in the room looks at you like you're an idiot afterward. I hate that feeling. And I think all of us have felt it. We have certain things that we like and do that maybe would embarrass us if everyone else found out about it. And I was thinking about this idea this week, that there are some things that we like so much that other people might not like as much as us. And I was trying to figure out what the right word to describe that is, a person who likes some particular thing more than everyone else, and I found it. That word is nerd. If you have something that you like more than the other people around you, that's actually the definition of a nerd. It's not a person wearing glasses and suspenders and with pins in their pocket or anything like that. The definition of a nerd is this: a person who is extremely enthusiastic and knowledgeable about a particular subject, especially one of specialist or niche interest. Here's my definition of a nerd. It's a person who likes something to the point that it's weird. That's the basic idea of a nerd. And my theory is that all of us, every one of us, has probably something in our lives that we are a nerd about. Something that you like more than other people like. And it's actually a good thing that all of us are nerds about something. The world would not have all of the perks and things that it has if we didn't have nerds among us. Let me give you some examples. If we didn't have people who were nerds about electronics and circuitry and computing, we wouldn't have the computers and the phones that are in our hands right now. Thank you, nerds. You know, that's one for the nerds. Thank you. That's one. We probably wouldn't have roads or bridges or planes, cars, things that help us do the things that we do in life. If we didn't have nerds, we wouldn't have those things. Thank you, nerds. They've done so much for us. Even you ladies. There are certain things that you ladies are nerds about. Now, I don't want to give too many details because my wife might get angry at me if I talked about it, but there are things that ladies pay attention to that men just have no idea about. And if we didn't have it, our life would not be as pretty or smell as good. So there are a lot of reasons that individual people are nerds. Now, don't get me started on Mark Terry, by the way. I saw this morning, I was watching this. You guys relate to this less because you guys listen to worship music like I did growing up. This is more contemporary. But I found out this morning something that I knew I'd heard before, but I saw it with my own eyes this morning, that Mark Terry is a choir nerd. I saw him getting the choir ready to sing at the 9:30 service, and the stuff that he does to get them singing is frankly terrifying. Just the way he behaves in that moment, and he was having entirely too much fun. He's a nerd. So anyway, all that's fine. That's good. Everyone's a nerd about something. And you might be wondering why I've started off this sermon by just firing shots all over the room, making people feel uncomfortable. It's because I'm about to reveal to you dark secrets from my past, things of myself where I have been nerdy about things and I have been hurt as a result. Around the end of the time I was in middle school and early in high school, a series of movies came out, and it was for this series called The Lord of the Rings. So it came out, and around the time I watched the first movie, I just was taken with the story. I loved it right away. I couldn't put my finger on why, I just liked it. And so when the second movie came out, I decided I'm going to read the books. Now, the books for the Lord of the Rings story are gigantic. They're tomes. They take a lot of work to read through. There's really good parts of the story, but then you have to read like multiple pages of a song written in Elfish, a language that doesn't exist. And then, he spends 15 pages talking about where an axe came from and who will. Anyway, I did the whole thing. I read the entire series and I loved it. And at the end of the time that the original series of movies came out, I watched the final movie with a group of friends of mine and I. So we went, I was near the end of high school, and there were some guys and some girls, and we went to this movie. And as you can tell, I loved the Lord of the Rings stories, and I really emotionally connected with them. I could not explain why, but I loved them. And so the last movie ended, and we were driving back to my friend's house. Everyone was in one car, and people were talking about the movie. So some of the guys and girls were saying the parts that they liked or that they didn't like or that they didn't understand. And I remember I was a little emotional at this moment because I loved the story so much. I said something along these lines. I said something like, I'm just so sad that it's over. I just wish there was more of it. And simultaneously, everyone in the car, especially the girls, this is what seared into my memory, they all looked back at once and they were like, we didn't realize we had a nerd on our hands here. Every one of those girls, if there was any chance of them being interested in me, gone at that moment. It all finished right at that moment, and I was mortified as a result. And I was thinking about that this week. Why is it that that story for the Lord of the Rings connected with me on such I don't know how to explain it, like a primal level? I loved the story. And it was something about the aesthetics of the story and the things that happened in the story. I just loved it. I loved it so much, and I couldn't explain what it was until a few years later. I was in college, and I read another book that gave some vocabulary to why I loved Lord of the Rings so much. By the way, there were parts where I was reading those stories where I felt like it gave me this overwhelming desire for something that I couldn't explain. I felt like I was connecting with the infinite. I couldn't figure out what it was, but then as soon as it was there, it was gone. Well, years later, I was reading a story, an autobiography of C.S. Lewis, and unfortunately, I feel like I've talked about him every time I've been here for the last few times, so my apologies. But he wrote in his autobiography, it's called Surprised by Joy, and he tells the story of how he ultimately became a believer. And Lewis explained that when he was little, he would have these experiences where he was reading from a story, or maybe he was listening to a piece of music, and he would have this overwhelming experience, a transcendent experience where he connected with something for a moment, and he called that experience, that pang of desire that he experienced at that moment, he called it joy. That was his explanation. Here's what he says about it. He says, joy is an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I wonder if you've ever had a moment like that in your life, where for just a brief second, you feel this overwhelming something that you can't explain, where you feel like you understand the universe, and then before you know it, the moment's gone. That's what Lewis is talking about here. He would see it in an image, or he would read it in part of a book. He would have this experience of joy, and for the rest of his young life, and up into his adulthood, he was trying as hard as he could to get back to that sensation of experiencing joy again. He says this, I call it joy, which here is a technical term and must be sharply distinguished from both happiness and from pleasure. So he said it's not as simple as being happy, and it's not something as base as experiencing pleasure. It's something deeper, something about there's this hunger or thirst that he didn't even realize is there until the pang comes. Joy, in my sense, has indeed one characteristic, and one only, in common with them, the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Apart from that, and considered only in its quality, it might almost equally be called a particular kind of unhappiness or grief, but then it is a kind we want. This explains a little bit of my experience with Lord of the Rings. I loved the movie, but it also almost made me sad at the end of it that it was gone. Why was it? It's because I had that pang of joy, but then it wasn't fully satisfied. Like, I know it was there, and the hunger and the thirst is there, but then it's gone. What exactly is it? At the end, he says this, I doubt whether anyone who has tasted it would ever, if both were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures of the world. But then, joy is never in our power, and pleasure often is. So he says there's this thing he experienced that it was so overwhelming that everything else, all the other smaller pleasures of life, don't seem as good anymore after he experienced it. Well, when I read these paragraphs of Lewis explaining that experience that he had, it made things light up in my mind and heart and of experiences I had had in the past of just this overwhelming desire that was not entirely satisfied, but it was there, and it made me think there must be something more. Well, Lewis found out when he got older that those pangs of joy that he was talking about, what those are, the song says it this way, it's a foretaste of glory divine, meaning you get a brief moment where you're experiencing the joy of the Lord, even though you can't fully experience it because you're still here on earth. For him, he wasn't even a believer yet. But that's essentially, I think, what Lewis is talking about. Joy is this quick vision we get of the future that God has for us, that before we know it, it's gone. I think Paul actually explained it in our main passage for today in verse 12, when he said, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face." So in the ancient world, they didn't have mirrors the same way that we do now. So you go into your room and or your bathroom and you'll have a mirror, and unless you put toothpaste on it or something, you get a pretty accurate representation of what you look like. Well, in the ancient world, they didn't have technology to make mirrors like that. Usually they were made of some sort of metal where the image you were seeing was not a great representation of the person in front of you. It was just an image, sort of a likeness, kind of cloudy. And that's the idea that Paul is trying to impart to us here, that the glory of the Lord and the goodness of God and knowing him in his fullness is something that while we are here on earth, we are experiencing it as in a cloudy mirror. We don't see it in entirety. It's there for a moment, and then when you step away from the mirror, it's gone. That's kind of what joy is. These brief moments of an overwhelming understanding of who God is, or the part of you that is designed to know the Lord, experiencing it for a second, but then it's gone afterward. Actually, by the way, this fact that every human at some point experiences these kind of pangs of joy is actually one of the best evidences that God exists in the first place. So let me give you an example. This is kind of how it goes. If you are hungry, if you experience hunger, that indicates that there is some sort of food that can satiate your hunger. You know, if you're thirsty, it's evidence that water exists, that your body was designed to drink. If you have an overwhelming desire, hunger, thirst for the divine, for the transcendent, it suggests that the transcendent is actually there. Now, those of us who are believers, we know that is true. God really is there. He really is the meaning and the purpose behind the universe. But there are only moments and glimpses where we get to see the fullness of who God is and why he's called us here. Now, if those things are true, and I know this is hard to wrap our minds around entirely, but my question is this. If we can't always experience joy, it's not always in our power to bring it forth. We can't manufacture feeling close to the Lord. How is it that we can operate our lives so that we actually experience the joy of the Lord more often? And I have a really simple formula for how we do it. I'll just tell you the formula here at the beginning. The formula is 1, we need to be inspired by true and beautiful things. And then 2, we need to be grounded in a godly lifestyle. And that's what will then lead you to living out the joy of the Lord. So let's talk about each of these parts. The first is this. We need to be people who are inspired by true and beautiful things. True and beautiful things. You cannot experience joy if you are spending your time on things that are not good, that are not true, that are not beautiful. Paul says it this way in Philippians 4. He says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things." So when I was a young person and I would read this verse, the way I would understand that is that Paul was saying, don't think about bad things because they'll get you in trouble, so just think about good stuff. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying here is dwell on things that are true, honorable, right, lovely, of good repute, and beautiful, because those are the things that give you a glimpse of who God is. It's not just to protect you from the bad stuff. It's that's what inspires you and enlightens you to become who God has made you to be. I don't think it's an accident that one of those overwhelming experiences of joy in my life came from reading a substantive work of literature like Lord of the Rings. Like, I'm probably not going to get that from reading Twilight. Now, I'm sorry to those of you who are big Twilight fans. You know, maybe you had the pang of joy when reading Twilight, but I think that was something else you were experiencing. I I don't think it was an accident that it was in reading something good and true and beautiful that it led me to this experience, because if you are fishing in the right pond, that's when you catch the fish that you want to catch. So Paul tells us, dwell on what is true, what is right, what is beautiful. If you're filling your mind with things that are not true, that are not beautiful, things that are ugly, things that are that appeal to base pleasures, that's not the kind of stuff that's going to lead you to experience real joy. When I think of people in the Bible who experience this joy often, or at least articulate it, the person that comes to mind for me is King David. David was a shepherd out in the fields. He eventually became the king of Israel. And we have a lot of his writings of things that he said and thought about when speaking to the Lord. In Psalm 73, he says this, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And besides you, I desire nothing on earth. My flesh and my heart fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." David simply says this, there is no pleasure on earth that I want other than to know you. Now, why does he say that? Is it because the other pleasures of earth aren't good? No, I think it's because he experienced the joy of the Lord, and so he realized it's better than everything else. The goodness of God, the goodness of knowing him, the fullness, the joy of experiencing him is so much better than anything else. That's why he says, I don't care about all the other pleasures of the earth. I just want to know you. In Psalm 84, he says this, "How lovely are your dwelling places, Lord of hosts. My soul longed and even yearned for the courts of the Lord." He's saying, my soul longed to be in God's presence. "My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God." Verse 5, "How blessed is the man whose strength is in you, and whose heart are the highways to Zion." Again, and whose heart is leading toward the presence of God. "Passing through the valley of Baca," that means weeping. "Through the valley of weeping, they make it a spring. The early rain also covers it with blessings. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them appears before God in Zion." He's saying this, a person who finds their strength in pursuing the Lord and wanting to know his presence, that person, even when the circumstances of their life are unhappy, even when they are sad, they still know that under the surface, they have an overwhelming optimism about life because they've experienced this joy. Something beyond the day-to-day experience of being around the people that you know, but it's communion with the divine, knowing God. At the end of this passage, he says this, "For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 outside. I would rather stand at the threshold of the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness." He says, the joy is so good, I'd rather have a moment with the Lord than have 10,000 moments somewhere else. Here's one of the main things that I would like to leave you with today. I'd rather you not forget any of the things I say today, but here's one thing that I definitely want you to remember. If you are a believer, if God has called you to be one of his people, he has not called you to just go through the motions and avoid doing bad things. God has called you for a purpose of being on fire. He has called you for the purpose of knowing him and experiencing his character and it changing you into being who he made you to be. If you are just walking through life like a zombie and you're a believer, what are you doing with yourself? If you have not experienced this pang of joy, why not? Are you fishing in all the wrong places? Are you looking at stuff that is not life-giving? Are you listening to stuff that is not life-giving? It's time for a self-evaluation if your life feels boring and you're a believer, because God has called you to know him. There is no pleasure better than experiencing the joy of the Lord. So, if that's true, I just want to talk about a couple areas that it might be worth looking if you are wanting to experience this joy of the Lord more often. The first one is this. If you want to fish in the right pond to experience joy, the first one is in God's word. This one is pretty self-explanatory. If you want to know God's character and see what he's like, you have to have a knowledge of God's word. You have to be dwelling on it and meditating on it and letting it form you. It's kind of a non-starter. Experiencing joy just probably won't happen if you are ignoring God's word entirely. The second one would be this, creation. Now this is kind of hard because we live in an industrialized society where we have roads and pavement and stuff everywhere. Sometimes, especially if you are wired to be an outdoorsman or outdoorswoman, you might need to be in nature to connect with the Lord, depending on who you are. Maybe you've been to the Grand Canyon before, or you've looked at an ocean, or you've been in the mountains, and you've had this kind of transcendent experience before in your life. If that's you, you need to find more times for you to be out in nature. Music. I know for me personally, a few of the moments in my life where I've had this experience of joy has been when I've connected with really good and beautiful music. So you might need to make time to listen to that in your life. Art and literature are the same way. I think there is a part of our minds and our hearts that that are tinged in a certain way when we encounter art. It's part of the reason art's important. It can posture our lives toward the Lord in a way that just words sometimes can't. And the last one I would say is this, relationships. If you have healthy relationships in your life, life-giving, self-sacrificial relationships, often those are the things that might attune you toward experiencing the joy of the Lord. So the first part is this: we have to live a life that's inspired by true and beautiful things. Now, some of you might be creative type, people that really enjoy that kind of stuff, and you're thinking, yes, I need to live my life with more inspiration. Well, if it comes easily to you, the second part of this is this: your inspiration has to be grounded in a godly lifestyle. Now, think about any sort of music festival you've ever seen or heard of. Usually, music festivals are full of people who are looking for some sort of emotional, transcendent experience, but it ends up being coupled with a whole bunch of other vices. Maybe it's drugs, maybe it's sexual temptation, all sorts of stuff goes along with it. And a lot of times people who are creative in nature fall astray when they don't pair it with living a godly lifestyle. So our inspiration through the beautiful things that we look at should be paired with living the way God has called us to live. Romans 12 says this: love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. So he says, don't lack in zeal, keep your spiritual fervor, but you need to love people sincerely, be devoted to one another, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with the Lord's people who are in need. So he says your lifestyle needs to be a godly, God-honoring lifestyle in addition to you experiencing inspiration. I don't know if you've ever seen this happen before, but a lot of times you might hear a piece of music or watch a TV show or something from a creative person that really connects with you, and there's a creative work of genius that happens, and you love the show or you love the music, but then you find out later that the creative person who made the show is like a monster and treats everyone around them terribly and just leaves destruction in their wake everywhere they go. Man, that's disappointing. That's not the kind of lifestyle that God's calling you to live. He's not just calling you to be inspired by beautiful things, but then treating everyone else around you like garbage. You have to be a person who is channeling the inspiration that the Lord is giving you into a lifestyle that honors the Lord. Back to our 1 Corinthians 13 passage, Paul says this: when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. So if we are living a life that is on fire for the Lord, it needs to be coupled with maturity that is not childish. Now, by the way, we are encouraged to be childlike in our faith and in the way we approach the Lord, but not childish, not selfish, not self-serving. We need to have a mature character that also seeks the Lord. I do want to spend a moment talking particularly to those of you who are young. Now, there's a lot of young people in this service, but if you're between the ages of maybe, let's say, 13 and 30, I think understanding this idea of the joy of the Lord is more important for you than for anyone else. And here's why. I think that when you are in this age range, when you're young, you are more open to these transcendent experiences of joy than you will be later in life. There's something about being young where there is just an ability for you to access these transcendent experiences, emotional experiences of enjoying the presence of the Lord or something like it. And here's my evidence for this. If you think back in the last 70, 80 years of American history, and you think about the craziest concerts where fans are just going crazy, having emotional experiences. So think about Elvis or the Beatles or things that happened in the 90s or leading up to, say, 10 years ago, like a One Direction concert. Or now, the best example of this now is Taylor Swift's tour that she's going on all over the world. Who are the people that are at these shows wanting to have transcendent experiences through their music? It's young people and their dads. But it's young people, mostly, who are there that are open to wanting to experience these things in a tremendous way. When you are young, you are open to this in a really unique way in your life. However, the vast majority of people, when they are young, waste their youth and their openness to the transcendent on foolish things. Jesus says it this way: there's a road that's wide and it leads to destruction. There's a road that's narrow and it leads to life. I think this is more true for young people even than for older people. If you take this moment of your life and you are looking for inspiration from the Lord, but also committing to live a godly lifestyle, God can do incredible things in your life. Paul says this to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:22. Now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. He says, stay away from the normal youthful lusts. You are not going to commune with God by going to a concert. Now, I'm not telling you not to go to concerts, by the way. Concerts are fine. But what I'm saying is that cannot be the outlet for you experiencing this joy. It needs to come from the Lord himself. Later, Paul says this. He says, look, no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example to those who believe. We had a pastor at our church. He died years ago. His name is Dr. Deloach, and he told me at one point when we were talking, he said he thinks that the history of Christianity, the things that God has done in the world through our faith, is really a history of youth movements in different times and places where God used young people on fire for him to change the world, to bring the gospel to new places. And I do think there's something special about that time of your life where if you apply yourself toward living a godly life and being open to the inspiration of the Lord, he can do incredible things through your life. Don't waste this time when you're young on foolish stuff. So, if we are looking for inspiration through true and beautiful things, and then if we ground that in a godly lifestyle, the result is that we get to then live out the joy of the Lord. We get to experience the joy of the Lord and show it to other people. In John 13, Jesus says this, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I've loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Jesus told his disciples, if people see you and they know that you actually know me, that you've experienced my joy, it's going to be obvious by the way you treat people. You are going to show it. You're going to live out the joy of the Lord. Paul says something similar in Philippians 2. He says, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. If you experience the joy of the Lord and you ground it in a godly lifestyle, it's going to be obvious to everyone who sees you. You're going to be united with other believers. You're going to love people in a really unique way. And God's going to do incredible things with your life. I had another experience late in college that I would like to share with you. I was given an assignment for a class, and it was to read a book, and it was a book by C.S. Lewis. Surprise, surprise. I'm sorry, I keep talking about him. But the book is called Till We Have Faces. I think I have a picture of one of the copies of the book here. This book is a retelling of a Greek mythological story. So the Greek mythological story is called the story of Cupid and Psyche. And so Lewis wrote this book. And something that's interesting about this to me is that Lewis, when he was young, he had these experiences, these pangs of joy, and a lot of them came from him reading Greek and Norse mythology. And so because he experienced some of these moments of joy reading these things, he decided, I'm going to read all of it. I want more of that joy, so I'm going to read more and more of it. Now, by the time he was an adult, because he spent so much time on these things, Lewis was really the world's foremost expert on Greek mythology and mythologies in different parts of the world. So he was incredibly smart and also just a gifted writer. So later in life, he's a believer at this point, and he writes this retelling of the Cupid and Psyche story. And the contents of the book are not that important, other than to say, I was reading the book because I had to, because of school, and the story follows two sisters for the entirety of the story. And finally, in the last chapter, he does a move where he changes the perspective of the story, where you're not just following the two sisters anymore. You see what's happening behind the scenes in the cosmos, like with the gods and all that stuff. What was really going on with those two sisters. So you think you're reading one thing, but really something else was happening behind the scenes. And I can't explain to you what happened very well in words, other than to say, I finished the book and my brain exploded. I don't know if you've ever had that before, where you watch a movie and there's like a brain explosion moment. Well, I put down the book. It was 1:30 in the morning. I had a paper due on it for the next day. And I just sat there catatonic for like an hour. And I can't explain what happened to me other than to say I had a religious experience in that moment. I felt a connection to God, that he had revealed something to me that I didn't understand before. And I just sat there, and I've never had another experience like it in my life. I just felt the joy of the Lord in this moment. And I thought about this as time has gone by, and I will say, I think that moment influenced the way that I think about the world, and I think about art, and I think about communicating with people. I remember walking away from that night and thinking, I want other people to experience what I just experienced. Is there any way that I could lead people to have that same sort of brain explosion moment of connecting with the Lord? And I meditated on it for longer and eventually came to this interesting thought that when Lewis was a kid, he was reading these stories and he was having these moments of joy and he was searching for it. And eventually that search for joy led him to the Lord. He then used his gifts that God had given him to write a lot, to write freely and use his gifts to share with other people, not knowing that 80 years later, some stupid kid in a dorm room at 1:30 would read one of his books and have a moment where they connected with the Lord as a result. His joy of the Lord led to me experiencing the joy of the Lord years later. And the thing that I want you to understand about this is that if you live in the joy of the Lord, there should be a compounding effect in your life where you can show it to other people too. I could probably name 10 to 15 people off the top of my head who lived the joy of the Lord and then showed it to me. People who've impacted my life in a tremendous way. And I have two simple questions for you if all these things are true. The first one is this: do you have people in your life right now that clearly show you what the joy of the Lord looks like? If you don't, find them. Where are they? Do you have people in your life that are not weirdos, they're normal, but they have one foot in their day-to-day reality and another foot in the clouds, in the divine, trying to pull you toward the Lord? That's what a person living the joy of the Lord looks like. It's a person who's fully present in their life, but they also have a glimpse of what's coming in the future, and they're trying to take you with them to get there. That's a person that lives the joy of the Lord. Do you have people like that in your life? If you don't, find them. Get rid of your friends who are losers and not calling you to do that. You don't want people who are pulling you away from the joy of the Lord. You want people who are pulling you toward Him. If they're not there, find them. My other question is this: are you the kind of person who is doing that? Are you pulling people toward the joy of the Lord, or are you just blending in with everyone else? Are you just settling for doing the things that are easy in life and what's comfortable, or are you living a life that's actually on fire? You know, one of the things that worries me, for myself personally, but then also for all of us, is something that my wife and I have happen almost every day. We'll have to check each other and ask, hey, how long have you been burying your face in your phone? Usually the answer is entirely too long. I don't wish upon anyone the pain of looking at your phone and getting your screen time update, for the week. I got mine earlier. I'm not telling you what it was. It was very sad. But a lot of us have our faces so buried in our phones that we are not having our hearts and our eyes and our ears attuned toward the things that will lead us to the joy of the Lord. My challenge for you today is this: find people that make you want to experience the joy of the Lord, and then you put an effort into showing it to the people around you as well. God has called you for a purpose. He's called you to know Him. He's called you to be inspired by who He is and to live out exactly who He made you to be. Don't waste your time on anything else. The joy of the Lord is the only thing that makes life worth living, so don't waste it on the stuff that's not there. So my final question is circling back to the thing I asked you at the beginning. If I ask you, what is joy, what is it, and do you have it?